Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Cheater. I'm the Executive Director of Facts First. Thank you for attending this morning. Facts First is a bipartisan organization focused on ensuring that the public discourse around congressional investigations is centered on facts. We stand ready to fight disinformation effects and efforts of far-right MAGA extremists determined to use powers of congressional oversight to pursue personal vendettas, to settle partisan scores, and to cover up their own criminality. We have organized today's panels to discuss two critical issues. The first is how true, credible, legitimate oversight ought to be pursued, and how Republicans will abuse that process over the next 2 years. And the second panel will discuss how the media ought to cover the MAGA version of congressional oversight. It is my honor to introduce today's speakers, which I will do throughout the morning, in staying true to belief that no one attends an event to hear long introductions. I will keep mine very short. Facts First is delighted to have the Honorable Carolyn Maloney speaking today. Representative Maloney spent 30 years in Congress representing the people of New York until just this January. The list of her accomplishments and achievements over those 30 years would fill our whole time this morning, so I will not say anything about them other than this. There is no one who is better able to speak about the upcoming congressional oversight than the most recent chair of the Oversight Committee. Representative Maloney understands that the Oversight Committee has an important function, that it can't be grandstanding and that it can't be trying to settle partisan scores. Instead, the Oversight Committee is about ensuring the legitimacy and integrity of our government. And I'm delighted, and we should welcome her to the podium to hear her comments about the role of the Congressional Oversight Panel and the importance of this moment.
Thank you all for being here today, and thank you to Facts First for putting together this important meeting. It's been an interesting 2 weeks since the Republicans took control of Congress. And of course, I use the term control in the loosest possible way. We all saw it took Kevin McCarthy 15 votes to finally fulfill his long-held ambition to become Speaker of the House of Representatives. But it's not through time or the number of roll calls that we should measure what it took for Kevin McCarthy to hold that gavel. Instead, we should look at the deals that he struck, the corrupt bargains he made to truly assess what he gave up to become Speaker. We've heard a great deal about the rules changes that will weaken him within his own conference, that a privileged motion to vacate the chair can be made by only one member is truly astonishing. That he would give the most extreme members of his party so many spots on the Rules Committee will absolutely terrorize him in the future. And it will terrorize the country for the next 2 years. That he will allow openly racist members to once again serve on committees that he will not even offer an opinion on George Santos, if that's his real name, tells you a great deal about Kevin McCarthy. I can just talk a little bit about the Rules Committee, not the Rules Committee, but the committee that I chaired, the Oversight Committee. And he put on some of the most extreme members of Congress. They almost have a majority. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, Scott Perry, Byron Daniels, Gary Palmer. All of these members fail to this day, no matter how many court cases say that President Biden was elected, no matter how many hearings, no matter how many reports, they still say that President Biden wasn't legally elected. Paul Gosar, who was removed from the committee because of his really attacks on other Democratic members or other members of the party, he's now back on the committee. So that just shows what the Oversight Committee is filled with now. But what should not and cannot be lost in all of this is the degree to which Kevin McCarthy has ceded the entire congressional Republican agenda to the MAGA extremists who are determined to use their newfound power to wage a war on facts, accountability, and democracy. I served in Congress for 30 years. I arrived in January of 1993, and starting in January 1995, I watched the Republicans in Congress use their majorities to launch investigation after investigation after investigation into the Clinton administration. More than that, though, they elevated the politics of personal destruction to newfound heights, focusing their powers on the private lives of countless individuals and investigating them over and over again. Even then, though, Republicans had a legislative agenda to pursue. I did not agree with it, but at least they had one. The investigations were a companion piece to their larger purpose and effort. Yet we see with these Republicans, they don't even have a goal. They don't even seem to have an agenda. They talk about investigating, who they're going to go after, what they're going to do, who they're going to discredit. And I will say that when Democrats were in power, we used the Oversight Committee and investigations to accomplish public good for the people. For example, reports were that the Postal Service was going bankrupt. We had hearings and we passed legislation to make them solvent. Our bill, the bill I authored, saved them over $107 billion, reorganized them, and put them on a path to solvency and service to the American people. We had hearings on civil service, and we made many, many reforms to make them more accountable, but also passed legislation, which we hope to pass for the whole country, and that's paid leave for the birth of a child, and paid leave, family and medical leave, very important to balance work and families. And the McKinsey report, which showed the absolute conflict of interest, where their people were working not only for the FDA, the regulators, but also working for the drug industry at the same time. And most of the time it was the same person. Outrageous conflict of interest, which I put in legislation to change. And one of our most important hearings were on the drug industry and abuses in it. And it helped lead to the way of passage of legislation to allow government to negotiate lower drug prices for Medicare, saving drug prices for all of our Americans, people, everyone in our country. So when we had investigations, we had a purpose. But with the Republicans, they don't seem to have a purpose except to investigate and destroy. Congressional Republicans today have no other calling than to engage in character assassination that distracts from real issues, creates a false perception of corruption, runs up legal bills, and threatens the livelihoods of those caught in the web of their lies. The danger here is not only that they will successfully employ scandal, outrage politics to halt the administration's forward progress on so many issues that matter to most Americans. Their effort actually has serious implications for accountability and for democracy itself. As part of his corrupt bargain, Kevin McCarthy agreed to create an entire committee focusing on the purported weaponization of the federal government. They're going to focus on the FBI and the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security, along with other executive branch agencies. But Republicans have already been hard at work seeking to destroy the public's faith, the public's view of the FBI and Department of Justice. And you've got to ask yourself, why? The answer is right in front of us. The very Republicans who are leading the effort to discredit the FBI and Department of Justice are the ones who tried to overturn American democracy. For the first time in history, we almost didn't have a peaceful transfer of power. And who inspired and then aided and abetted the insurrectionists to attack the United States Capitol on January 6th. Republicans want to go after the FBI to make that agency and the Department of Justice appear politically motivated as a way to obstruct investigations into their own conduct. These Republicans want to attack and investigate the January 6th committee for the same reason. And Kevin McCarthy agreed to it all because he was desperate for those votes. He was willing to use committee assignments and committees and the investigatory power of the United States Congress as a bargaining chips for his own personal gain and election. As Voltaire said, with great power comes great responsibility. In Kevin McCarthy's mind, with great irresponsibility comes great power. Congress's oversight authority is an important one. It is part of the checks and balances that ensure a functioning and accountable government. Throughout history, Democrats and Republicans alike have harnessed that power for noble and important purposes for the American people. Kevin McCarthy's decision to use the committee system to buy his way to the speakership undermines the credibility and integrity of the entire system. For the next 2 years, we will know that Republicans are abusing the Congressional committee system to deflect and destroy. And we will know that Kevin McCarthy gave them the keys to do so because he lacked the courage to stand up to the extremists in his own party. The personal vendettas these committees pursue are not a legitimate use of the oversight power. The attempts to obstruct investigations into their own criminality are not an appropriate use of subpoena power, and their assault on facts and truth are not going to go unanswered. Kevin McCarthy very well may not outlast a head of lettuce. The damage of his corrupt bargain and what it's done to Congress, though, will last for at least 2 years. We must fight their efforts at every step to ensure that in the future, Congress's oversight role is not simply a negotiating chip for power. We must challenge their attempts to cover up their own abuses of power by attacking those who seek to hold them accountable. And we must respond to their misinformation and lies with context and truth. In short, we must put facts first. So I thank Facts First for bringing us together today. Thank you.
So we are fortunate to have Congresswoman Maloney join us for the first panel that we are presenting. I'd like to invite our other panelists to come up. I will keep it short as I ask them to come up. So Don Goldberg, he can raise his hand, we'll do it this way. Spent over a decade as a senior staffer on Capitol Hill, including on the House Government Operations Committee, the predecessor to the House Oversight Committee, and also the House Judiciary Committee. And then he was a special assistant to the president as part of the Clinton administration's communications team managing investigations. Norm Ornstein, to Don's right, is a political scientist and emeritus scholar at the conservative think tank American Enterprise Institute. He has published numerous books and articles on Congress as an institution, and he is an unrivaled expert in the realm of congressional dysfunction. That sounds like an insult. I did not mean it in that way. He's an expert in congressional dysfunction and how to solve it. And then our panel will be moderated by Facts First co-chair David Jolly. A former Republican, David represented Florida's 13th congressional district in the United States House of Representatives from 2014 to 2017. Since leaving the House, David has been a commentator on MSNBC and a regular proponent of good government and congressional sanity. So please welcome our panel.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of today's discussion. I thought what we would do for the sake of this panel is very simply break down a quick inventory of the investigations, talk about where there are some legitimate threads of inquiry and where there are the illegitimate threads, and then strategies for responding to both, responsibility, frankly, for how to handle a response, particularly in the areas of legitimate inquiry. So my checklist, and I'm going to ask you to add to this and tell me what I'm missing, but I think there's a bucket of what Republicans will consider security investigations. That would be the border, Afghanistan, Hunter Biden, and I suppose now the document story. And then there are what I call the base, feed the base investigations, which will be the inquiry into Dr. Fauci and all things COVID, the inquiry perhaps into the treatment of January 6th inmates, or whatever you call those jailed in the DC jail, and I guess this weaponization committee, which ultimately will feed the base with the suspicion that the government's out to get you. That's 7 or 8, I believe. Are there some that I have missed? And I guess I would ask, as part of this, where do you think they go first? Congresswoman, how long does it take to ramp up? How do they rack and stack and prioritize or amplify?
I would say they've been ramping up for a long time. During my time as chair, they always came in with a Biden attack that we had to debate and defeat. So they've been ramping up on attacking the president personally, attacking his family, particularly his son, attacking Fauci, a wonderful scientist in my view, who gave his life to trying to help people, and the border, always the border. Every single time they would have resolutions and actions and legislation that they were putting forward in all the areas that you mentioned. So they've been ramping up and getting ready for a long time.
How do they, Norm or Don, how do you prioritize, right? I mean, in politics, you can't have 8 different messages. And where do you expect them to go with the investigation strategy? Jim Jordan said at CPAC it is about beating Joe Biden in 24 and re-electing Donald Trump. Those were his words. What can you expect for how they roll this out?
Oh, one thing I would add to your numbers is China. I think we are going to see a whole lot of inflammatory investigations into China's behavior, and probably they'll try and tie Biden, Tony Blinken, and others to that as well. This is one of the interesting little paradoxes. If you had a strong speaker who also had some strategic vision, which of course we don't, you could then work with the committees to make sure that you timed investigations to the rhythm of the media as well. And you would focus 1 week perhaps on the border. You'd have your people go down to the border. You would try and make that the major thing. Then you might shift to Hunter Biden. But because they've decentralized so much, it's in the hands of the committees and the subcommittees. And that may dilute some of the impact of what they're doing. But keep in mind, there's another element to this that's also important to them. They want to hamstring the administration and tie all of those officials down. So one of their benefits from their perspective of having multiple investigations going on at all times is they're going to haul in officials, they're going to subpoena them, they're going to go for documents, they're going to try and keep them from doing their jobs. And that is going to be somewhat effective. My guess is that we're going to see a lot of officials refusing subpoenas. We now have a precedent from what Republicans did in the past, and get into perhaps some legal battles. But I don't think they're going to be able to target the way that they would if it were to get maximum public effect. Having said that, you know that as they do these investigations, for a lot of the media, it will be all investigations all the time. And that's something the next panel will talk about a lot, but we need to talk about as well, the responsibility here to separate it out.
And David, if I could follow up on Norm's point, which I totally agree with, they don't have any strategy. I don't see any priorities either. And I think because they've decentralized, that they're throwing this out to the committees, they'll actually be battling each other to get attention. Yeah, and in the Clinton years, and Carolyn, remember this, the first thing they did was the Waco hearings because they had promised the NRA they would go after the gun provisions. And that became that one committee couldn't decide, GovOps at the time, which is now the Oversight Committee, couldn't decide, and with Judiciary, who should do it. They ended up doing a joint thing. Right. And it made it, as a Democratic staffer, it made it a lot easier for us to defend and refute and putting context around what they were trying to do, and really, I think they didn't get very far on that.
Do you think, Don, so one of the narratives here that's important to keep in mind is the legitimate role of oversight. Do you think they risk diluting some of the legitimate inquiries by just throwing everything at the wall?
Absolutely, and I think this special committee, the weaponizing of the government, I mean, how do you get your arms around that? How do you have a coherent strategy? It would take months to figure that out. Plus, all these committees have to meet, they have to organize, and they have to pass committee rules. And that's not an easy task. They have to hire staff, they have to get their budgets. So they may try to come out quickly out of the gate, but I don't think it'll be very organized if they do it too quickly.
What I find the biggest difference is that they don't have a goal of how you're going to help the American people. The reason that all of us are in Congress is to make our country stronger, better, and more responsive to our people. But when they talk about these investigations, they're not talking about any goal of helping people. It's like, we're going to go after Biden and his family, we're going to go after the border, we're going to go after China. And I'd say that in the Oversight Committee, having lived through it in the last 2 years with Mr. Comer, I think that he will prioritize the border, Hunter Biden, and China, Wuhan. Because that was his themes in the last 2 years.
You know, we have to consider one other element here, which is they're out to protect their own who are deeply culpable in the January 6th violent insurrection. They eviscerated the Office of Congressional Ethics for one main reason. It wasn't George Santos. It was much more Boebert, Green, et al., Gosar, Biggs, who were culpable in this. And these investigations to discredit agencies, to go after the January 6th committee itself, that's going to be another part of this, is an attempt to make sure that they are not held accountable for their own actions. But to get to your larger point, David, take it back to the Benghazi hearings. Now, there were legitimate reasons to want to look at what happened in Benghazi. What were we doing about embassy security? We know there were funds out there. They were probably misallocated. Why did we not have the right protections in place? That had nothing to do with it. Remember, Kevin McCarthy himself crowed on national television, we accomplished our major goal, which was to damage Hillary Clinton. Now we're going to see investigations of Afghanistan that are probably not going to focus on what would be legitimate inquiries into how we missed the fact that it was going to collapse immediately, why we screwed up the exit. Now, I mean, I just saw on public radio another tragic case of an Afghan who had helped the United States throughout this conflict, who wasn't able to get out, somehow escaped, made his way tortuously through to the Mexican border to get into the United States, and is now in jail and may well be deported back to Afghanistan. You know, there are questions here that you want to ask about how government is dealing with all of this. That's not going to be any part of it. And one core part of oversight is to look at agencies and whether they're faithfully executing the laws, whether you need to change the law, whether you need to clean house in some fashion. That's not going to be a part of any of this. It's all going to be weaponizing. And, some of these investigations, it would be like if we gave Al Capone the power to investigate Elliot Ness.
So Don, as a follow-up, maybe elaborate on where you see legitimate threads of inquiry. Choose the investigations, right? Republicans clearly are aware they need to move off of a Hunter Biden investigation to make it a Joe Biden investigation. Are there threads of legitimate inquiry there? Are there threads of legitimate inquiry around the border? Or is it really a policy question? Walk us through where you see the legitimate threads of inquiry.
Well, and maybe Norm can do that better than I can. I think China, I think the border, I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan, although everybody wanted to get out, including President Trump, so I don't know what that gets them other than some of these horror stories. So there are a lot of those legitimate issues. I think the illegitimate ones are pretty clear too.
Right.
I think the Hunter Biden, obviously, the weaponizing. And what happened again, going back because I'm a dinosaur here to the Clinton years, They threw as many plates of spaghetti against the wall as they could, trying to find one strand of spaghetti that would stick. And occasionally they found something that was legitimate and they could go after, but mostly it was just a dirty wall.
And I ask because for those who, both at Facts First, who are prepared to respond to some of these inquiries, but for those who work on the Hill or in the administration and will need to respond, you do kind of have to be nimble enough to recognize the legitimate questions that will come out of some of this and treat those, with a certain sobriety. But we can anticipate that the majority of the inquiries are going to be salacious and not worth a legitimate inquiry. And I do want to get to that, kind of how do you respond and handle these inquiries. One foundational question, though, I'm curious your thoughts on this. It would seem to me Republicans have overpromised their base that they are going to accomplish anything legislatively. Right, you see them already beating their chest about the IRS agents and maybe a pro-life bill they did last week and so forth, as though they're going to enact these things into law. They will not. They will run 2 years with nothing to show for it legislatively. So 2 years from now, is this truly going to be a Congress and a political environment defined almost solely by these investigations? Is this really the theme for 2 years that Republicans will put out into the marketplace?
I think it's hard to run on investigations. I believe that one of the reasons the Democrats did so well in the midterm elections when everybody was saying we're going to be trounced is that we had a record to run on. Mm-hmm. We had literally combated COVID with the American Rescue Plan. We had passed the first infrastructure bill in years in a bipartisan way. We'd passed the Postal Reform Bill, which was my bill. We passed the Reduce Inflation Act, which really focused on the environment and competition with China, issues that we really are important to our economy, our future, and our security. But what I hear, the biggest, starkest difference that I hear is that the Democrats outlined, this is what we want to do, this is what we want to accomplish, and under President Biden's leadership, we accomplished a great deal. And I believe that's why we did so well, because the people saw what we did to help them. What I find astonishing, they outline all these investigations, but nothing that they're going to do to help people. I mean, that's the purpose of government, to help people. But they say, we're going to get this one, we're going to weaponize this one. The FBI they're really the criminals. They're not after criminals. They're the criminals. I mean, the whole thing is upside down. And Jamie Raskin, my good friend, they have put a majority of MAGNA disbelievers and January 6th conspiracy theories and election conspiracy theories where they just deny the truth. So I really want to thank David Brock for coming forward with Facts First, and hope your group is out there pointing out the facts every single day. What I found was the most astonishing in my work on the committee is how they completely don't believe anything. It's like we would have hearing after hearing on the legitimacy of the election, the court cases that President Biden won. And even I remember we had a whole series on Arizona and the Arizona election where Republican election people came in and said it was an honest election from A to Z. And I thought, well, now they'll finally have to agree. These are Republicans telling them it was an honest election. Right after they left, they said it was stolen. I said, you just heard 2 days of testimony about how honest it was. So anyway.
Norm, you're both
I hope the future's better than the past in their record. That's all I can
Norm,
say.
you're both a student and scholar of the institution. Will this Congress truly be a Congress defined by its investigations?
I think it may be slightly more than that. And remember, part of these investigations, by the way, the FBI especially, and the intelligence agencies are, I call it a Festivus investigation. It's about airing past grievances. And it's all about Hillary Clinton and Russia and the Russian hoax, which was not a hoax. So there'll be some of that. But, to step back, if you are a party in a divided government and you have one house and you don't have a positive agenda, you're not going to work with the other side, which is traditionally what we hope will happen with divided government. You got two powers. You've got the investigative power and you have the negative power of the purse. And I think we may see this Congress defined more by the latter than the former in the end. So we know, I wrote a piece in October in the Atlantic saying if they get elected to the House, the debt ceiling is going to be in great jeopardy. As you know, we came this close in 2011, and John Boehner saved it. Kevin McCarthy was pushing towards the abyss. Even if he wanted to, couldn't stop it. Mitch McConnell is very upset now because he knows what that will do to the Republican brand. Yeah. And I fear what will happen there. But it's beyond that. I suspect we're going to see a Congress defined as well by rolling government shutdowns, because they're going to try to use the appropriations process, look towards September, October, and they're going to make a series of demands. And one of the other things that may define them is because we now have some of their own members saying, we ought to raise the retirement age. And they're obviously, they've passed, as part of the rules, the 3/5 rule again, that it takes 3/5 to raise taxes. They're going to push for more tax cuts. But going after Social Security and Medicare, which has defined the Republican Party in the past in a very negative way, is something that may end up getting them caught. And of course, this committee to investigate is also trying to go after all of government. They want to destroy not just the intelligence agencies, the FBI, the Justice Department, the Department of Homeland Security. Imagine putting Marjorie Taylor Greene on the Department of Homeland Security. Yeah. But it's also to try and blow up the rest of the federal government. And that may end up being the biggest takeaway from what they do in these 2 years.
I think that's a very dangerous move they made, because it will foment resentment with the base, right? You get in some very dangerous territories when you start telling people your government's out to get you. But you bring up a very interesting point. And I think you can draw a line from the debt ceiling debate and appropriations to the investigations for this reason. I think there's an open question. One, shutdowns are now going to be baked in. Without question, that's how they're going to prove they're strong fighters. This question around the debt ceiling, though, McCarthy is going to have to work with Dems, or he's going to get rolled by Dems. Some way he's not going to be able to keep the promise he made to his caucus, which leads then to how does he survive that politically? And what I'm watching for is, does it force McCarthy to go even deeper into the investigation narrative, right? Does he have to become the investigation warrior who wants to impeach Joe Biden to survive the politics of his own caucus once he strikes a deal with Schumer and Jeffries and the Democratic White House on the debt ceiling? That'll be an interesting thing to watch. Let me ask a question, and perhaps Don, in this question of responding to the legitimate and the not legitimate, I suppose responding to legitimate is pretty straightforward, right? You approach these hard questions with sobriety and facts, and you deal with it. In this circus of the crazy inquiries, go back to your years with the Clinton White House, your time on the Hill. How do you handle that? What's the strategic response?
So I think, thanks Dave for asking that question, because this is really tactical, but I think that the Democratic members and the staff have to really get involved in these investigations, no matter how distasteful, because you've got to be there to know what they're going after, what questions they're going to ask, what they're trying to show. So you've got to make sure you've got rules on your committee, if you can get them, that allow the Democratic staff to be part of the depositions, that get the documents as soon as they come in so you can evaluate them, and in some cases get them out when you need to. We've found that sometimes it was valuable to have Democratic members at the depositions, because when it was just staff run, it could get pretty testy, pretty nasty, and there's no way, there's no referee there, which is really the chairman, Republican chairman, but Democratic members there, or Republican members for that matter, tend to bring that temperature down because staffers don't want to go too far with members there. One thing that I saw in the House rules Republicans passed is that agency attorneys are not allowed to participate in these depositions or interviews. That means that a lot of agency people could come in either unrepresented, which is untenable, or the agencies won't be in a position to assert if there's a privilege issue, if there's a document issue, if there's questions that need to be. There's going to be no room for that. So it's very important that the Democrats make sure, the Democratic staffers make sure that any witness has an attorney. If anybody out there needs an attorney and can't get one, contact me or Facts First. We will find people. There are people who will volunteer to do this out there for you. So really getting involved, really participating. And the other last thing I would say is, You know, Democrats tend to have messages that are this long, Republicans have bumper stickers. We need to reverse that. You need to find messages that are going to take hold and people are going to listen to and understand what's going on. It's not that easy, but you gotta do the work.
So let me ask a general question, this kind of messaging strategy. I know the next panel will be about how the press is to handle this. But in terms of those who play in the press and are in charge of messaging, on some of the salacious, illegitimate inquiries, take Hunter Biden as an example, or probably a lot of stuff around COVID and Fauci. Do you, Norm and Congresswoman Maloney, take the bait and then try to refute it? Do you contextualize around it's an insincere claim? Do you at times, for instance, when subpoenas are issued by, say, a Jim Jordan who refused to comply with a subpoena himself, go towards the kind of personal and political integrity of the person asking for the oversight? How do you respond to an illegitimate inquiry? in the public arena.
Well,
yeah, with facts.
Facts, that's why we're here.
yeah, that's one of the main benefits of having facts first. I think we need some outside ammunition. It's not just inside. But I do think you have to you use all of those weapons. The one thing you don't do, which Democrats have tended to do in the past, is to say, that's so ridiculous, nobody could believe it, and they let it go.
Right.
And if it's out there and it's not refuted, it's believed. So it has to be refuted, but I also think there has to be enormous pressure on a press corps that desperately wants to normalize the abnormal, that desperately wants to treat investigations in a Republican House the same way they treated investigations in a Democratic House. And they want to make illegitimate investigations look the same as legitimate investigations. And that's, many of us, including the great journalist John Harwood, who will be on the next panel, have fought against that it has to be unvarnished truth. It's not just both sides are the same, but there has to be, they're not going to do it on their own. I noticed today the Columbia Journalism Review did a little interview with the great Margaret Sullivan, who unfortunately has now retired from writing her column about the press in the Post, about the classified documents. And it was an interesting and quite balanced interview, but she said, the glee of people when this first emerged, that finally they've got something in a White House that was boring because it didn't have those scandals, where they could play it that way. Now they've pulled back from it, and now it's a little bit more, we're looking at the differences. But the initial coverage, I think, was emblematic of what we tend to see in the press. One other point I'd like to make, David. You know the House Republicans better than any of us. Although you don't know them all, but they're not all lunatics or all just determined to blow everything up. Some of them would legitimately have come here because they'd like to do something positive. Unfortunately, most of them are moral cowards, and when bad stuff happens, they don't step up to try and put a brake on it. But I could see some legitimate oversight investigations being done this time. I can imagine, for example, move past the nonsense at the border, that it's an open border when they're, basically capturing more fentanyl at the border than we ever have before. But we do have a fentanyl crisis in the country. Can I imagine Republicans and Democrats in the House actually doing some oversight into what we do about not fentanyl coming in over the border, but about what is an extension of the opioid crisis? Yeah, I could see that happening. Is it possible, although they're going to try and go after Pete Buttigieg because he is so good on all the stuff that's happening with the airlines, the near crash in New York, the shutdown, which had nothing to do with him. But is it legitimate to begin to look at why the airlines screwed up everything over the holidays? Somebody said, what's the difference between Southwest Airlines and the coronavirus? The coronavirus is airborne. We have problems within the industry, and we have problems, obviously, with outdated software and with air traffic control. So there's stuff that they could do that would be absolutely legitimate, but that'll get drowned out by the illegitimate.
Sure. Let me ask, we're about out of time, so final question, for each of you to opine on. Who is the most important audience for the response to these investigations? Is it to inform a Democratic base that is prepared to take a defensive position of the White House? Is it the independent? Is it the press? Who is the audience that's most important to reach with the counter narrative and the response?
Well, I'll go first. That's kind of a political question, so I should defer to Caroline. But clearly, you got to show the base that you're fighting back. And you got to give the press something to do a counter narrative and context around it. So those two clearly are key audiences in my mind.
I would say it's all of the above. You've got to reach out to all of them. And you've got to speak to the American public, Republicans and Democrats. And I would say the best legislation is always bipartisan, and I agree with Norm that we should try to work in a bipartisan way, in a positive way, as we did with the postal bill. It was definitely, I could never have passed it without Republican support. And I also believe that the debt ceiling is going to be the first step, and actually tomorrow, Thursday, we reach the debt ceiling, according to Janet Yellen, although it won't really hit us until, I think she says, June. But we've got to remember, these are debts that we already have. We have to be responsible for the debts that we have. We can't, it's not about the future, it's about the debts that we have and being responsible, and how that's handled is going to be a defining moment going forward. But I would say it's the press, it's the American public, and you win elections by convincing the people, the voters. So it's basically the voters, the people in America.
I ask about the audience because there are people you're never going to reach. Sure. Shortly after the first document story broke from the White House, I flipped over to Fox to see how they were handling it. And Newt Gingrich was using the term Biden crime family. And this will be the unraveling of the Biden crime family. That's not an audience you're going to reach with the counter narrative. And so how do you expend resources on which audience to reach? Well,
I think you pointed out that it was Gingrich that started the whole politics of
That's
personal
right.
destruction. He went after the Clintons like a dog after a bone. I mean, every day, calling them everything in the world. So that's what he does. But on the documents, there's such a clear difference.
Right.
You know, President Biden did everything right. He turned over the documents. You're talking about 300 missing documents that are highly classified to roughly 10 to 20. He complied immediately. And President Trump is now under investigation for obstruction of justice, a possible indictment. There's no comparison between the way how they treated it. And, you know, he fought us for years. We were trying to get the documents. We had to subpoena them. To get them. President Biden turned them over immediately.
Ladies and gentlemen, Don Goldberg, Norm Ornstein, Congresswoman Maloney. Thank you very much.
Good to see you.
Thank you very much to our first incredible panel. Our second one, as you heard, focuses on how media should cover the upcoming investigations. And we'll kick things off hearing from Facts First President David Brock. David is no stranger to the world of right-wing conspiracy masquerading as fact. He's founded media watchdog group Media Matters and has been a mainstay within Democratic politics for the last 20 years. So please welcome David Brock to the podium.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. It's an honor and a pleasure to frame our next panel on what we're going to expect from press coverage of the ongoing congressional onslaught from the Republicans. You have to forgive me if I observe that I do have more than a bit of deja vu in approaching the subject of scandal politics and the media. Of course, I worked myself in right-wing media for more than a dozen years, and I generated my share of scandals. For the past 20 years, through my work with Media Matters, I've studied right-wing media and its impact very closely. And in 2016, I ran a super PAC called Correct the Record, which responded to false attacks on Hillary from both our political opponents and the news media. Our goal then, as it is now in Facts First, was threefold. First, ensure that the public and mainstream media recognize right-wing media for what it is, political propaganda for the Republican Party. Second, disrupt the flow of that propaganda into credible media outlets. And third, when we fail at the second, we have to hold the mainstream media's feet to the fire and ensure accurate coverage. Correct the Record worked in 3 areas: the Benghazi hoax, the smears on the Clinton Foundation, and but her emails. Benghazi was wholly a production of Fox News, and we made sure that it stayed that way. There was one exception. When Laura Logan at CBS News published a report on the Benghazi attack that contained false information from one of her sources, we put pressure on that forced her to take a leave of absence and ultimately leave that network. The Clinton Foundation was more of a challenge. While we did succeed in getting the good works of the foundation reported far and wide, it was a major disappointment when the New York Times struck a deal with a right-wing author to retail some of his phony wares right into the newspaper of record. We pushed back hard on that, so much so that a top Times editor took me to dinner to call off the dogs. That was off the record, so I won't say what happened there. Even though everyone knew that Hillary's predecessors had used private email, they also knew that there had been allegations of rule breaking and law breaking that were debunked. A narrative still took hold in both right-wing and mainstream media that Hillary had somehow done something vaguely wrong. It was a narrative that was hard to dislodge. So Hillary's emails became something of a Rorschach test. People who liked her saw, no, they're there. People who didn't like her used the emails as an excuse. When the Comey letter hit, lock her up suddenly had a little bit of resonance with a few of those fence sitters. We narrowly lost the election, and ironically, we lost it to an actual criminal. I learned a few lessons from the Correct the Record experience that I wanted to share with you today. Though we call ourselves facts first, the reality is that in today's toxic media environment, facts aren't always first, or second, or third. So when you think about facts first, don't think of a dozen researchers Googling around in their pajamas. Facts First will be first and foremost a strong messaging operation, fact-based always, but we're going to go toe-to-toe with powerful right-wing noise machine in creating our own narratives and storylines to show the public that we're right and they're wrong. One example of this work we have done, Congressman Maloney mentioned it earlier, was what we call the corrupt bargain, through which Kevin McCarthy was able to win the speakership. It's obvious now to everyone that a series of behind-the-scenes dirty deals were struck with MAGA extremists in exchange for power. But Facts First framed that debate in early November. That's when we first came out with Corrupt Bargain, and when it wasn't obvious at all. And that has been very effective all the way through. That's just an example of the kind of messaging work we want to do. Social media was an arena in which Correct the Record was outgunned by right-wing digital forces. We're not going to have that happen again. Our investment in social media strategies for Facts First is well into the millions of dollars, more than double what we spent in Correct the Record. Let me conclude with a few guideposts for coverage going forward, hopefully without sounding too preachy. I know the reporters here know how to do their jobs and probably don't need too many reminders, but I can't help just a few. First, don't rehash old conspiracy theories as if they're new, and don't ask questions that have already been answered. The Hunter-hating narrative has been well established for years. Credible outlets, from Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal to the New York Times just last week, have thoroughly investigated the allegations against the president and found no wrongdoing. Don't easily fall for GOP spin. In November, Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee released a report on the so-called politicization of the FBI and the DOJ. Even a cursory review by Facts First revealed that the 1,050 pages, including 1,000 pages of recycled letters, some of them reproduced over 90 times, as a way for the right to manufacture the appearance of substance. And yet many media outlets continue to refer to a 1,000-page report without that important context. Context, of course, is the key element in accurate coverage of the Biden document story. With some exceptions, major media have been providing that critical context. And I have yet to see anyone outside the right-wing echo chamber imagining Hunter Biden secretly climbing through garage windows at the Biden family home. And I hope I won't. With that, I will stop now, and you'll hear from the folks you really want to hear from. I'll turn it back over to Michael for the introduction of the media panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. On our panel today, we're joined by Kurt Bardella. Kurt served as the Republican spokesperson for the House Oversight Committee before becoming a Democratic strategist and advisor. He is a contributor to MSNBC and appears regularly on Morning Joe. John Harwood has been a renowned journalist for decades. He has served as CNN's White House correspondent and the chief Washington correspondent for CNBC. He regularly appears on a wide range of news and public affairs programs, too many, in fact, to name. Meredith Shiner is a writer and communication strategist. She worked as a national political reporter in Washington, and her writing has appeared in Politico, Roll Call, Congressional Quarterly, The Economist, and Rolling Stone, to name a few. And then moderating our panel today is Maria Cardona, who, like David Jolly, has enjoyed an incredible career before landing her dream job as co-chair of Facts First. Maria is a political strategist, a CNN commentator, and is founder of Latinovations. Welcome, panel.
Thank you. Thank you. Buenos dias. Thanks, everyone, for being here. We just had a terrific panel that really set up, I think, what's going to be a very interesting and important conversation for us in terms of how does the media today approach these investigations, these hearings, in a way that will really engage and educate the public as to what's really going on. And that is hard because of what we just heard on the first panel. You're going to have one side, I'm not going to call it a whole political party because it's not, but there is a wing, a faction of that political party that will present their side as facts, but they really are lies, conspiracy theories, and other things that have already been debunked. And then you have the side that will actually be facts. So, Meredith, let me start with you. How do journalists approach this conundrum?
So I think that's a great question, and it's something that reporters are thinking about, but probably not thinking about enough given what's happened over the past 6 years. And so I want to start with two places. One, you were saying that it's not a whole party, but I think one of the problems with DC coverage is that we're using the term MAGA instead of Republicans. When you look at the vast majority of the party, this is who they are. It is much more comfortable to isolate Trump or to say that this is fringe, but this is the majority of the Republican Party. And the second point that I wanted to make, and I don't mean to go after the hashtag of the corrupt bargain. I do think, like, the people in this room, I assume that you're C-SPAN nerds like me, right? And that you watched all of the speaker votes over and over again with great interest because the personality politics of it, fascinating, right? But to me, the vote that mattered most was the vote that happened on January 6th. I want to give a lot of credit to congressional reporter Jen Bendry of Huffington Post because she's been consistent in making the point that there were 2 attacks on the Capitol that day. There is the violent insurrection and the images that we felt like were so shocking. But then there was the vote. 147 Republicans, after seeing what they saw, after fearing for their lives, voted to reject a free and fair election. Included in that was Kevin McCarthy. Kevin McCarthy still gets invited to state dinners at the White House. There's so much that happens in DC media and politics to perpetuate the idea of comfort that the things that used to work for us still do. And what I would like people to understand is that it's broken, and the brokenness doesn't come from nowhere. In the previous panel, people were asking what the strategy of the Republican Party is. There doesn't have to be a clear strategy under the old rules when the strategy is chaos. I live with a 2-year-old. I don't know how he'll wake up every morning and he doesn't have a strategy, but that doesn't mean that my life isn't chaos sometimes. And so we need to accept the things that are real in front of us because they're urgent. And so what I would love to see from DC reporters is to incorporate that urgency. Because these investigations, they might be a distraction, but taking the full faith and credit of the United States in your hands, being willing to blow up the global economy, being willing to blow up our democracy, that's Kevin McCarthy, and that was Kevin McCarthy before he took a selfie with Marjorie Taylor Greene on the House floor after his 15th vote. And we shouldn't be afraid to say that because we want to go for cocktails after work with the people who will continue to have power because there have been no political consequences for January 6th.
Those are very good points, and it really does underscore the urgency, John, but I also think that also underscores the additional difficulty because Kevin McCarthy is now the Speaker of the House. And you can't really ignore that. So then how do you do what Meredith just said we have to do, which I believe, but at the same time be seen as a journalist that is giving both sides, and again, the position of Speaker of the House, I guess the credibility that it should have, but now that Kevin McCarthy is in there, how do you make those distinctions and cover it as it is supposed to be covered?
First of all, thanks for having me. It's a very difficult issue. Those are very difficult questions, and let me just start out by making a few points. One, I'm uncertain myself as to how much difference it actually makes what the tenor of coverage of these investigations, for example, is. We've seen in our politics that it is so deeply rooted in people's identity now that very large and what we would think of as impactful events don't move that many voters. And I would say the same thing about coverage. Television audiences tend to be small. Newspapers are struggling for eyeballs. And so there's a question as to, A, how important it is. Secondly, I would say I don't presume to tell the mass of journalists how to do their jobs. But I can say how I do it and what I think is important. And what I think is important is that, A, we tell the truth at all times. Two, we try to make distinctions between things that are important and things that are unimportant. We are fair to both sides, but that doesn't mean taking things that aren't alike and making them look alike. And
the
so
false equivalency, correct?
Right. We are, the way I approach it is, and it's different for me because I've been doing this a long time from some people who are newer in the business who may not have the confidence in their own judgment to say this is legit and this isn't. So one of the advantages of getting older is that you've seen a lot of things and you can make some qualitative distinctions. But what I try to do is say, what do I know? What am I confident that I know? And how can I distinguish between things that might look alike? So, I mean, just to take some examples, is it the same that some Democrats in the past have objected in the House to electoral vote counts? Right. Is that the same as the January 6th insurrection? No, it's not the same. Is it the same that some Democrats in the past resisted increasing the debt limit for Republican presidents, but then ultimately did not trigger a crisis and did it, with people who actually are going to take us right up to the brink or trigger a debt crisis? Are those things the same? No. Is it the same that you have a president in Donald Trump who lied about everything all the time? Is that the same as Joe Biden saying, I want to make this statement about my good friend? Well, it's actually not his good friend. That's a lie. So they both lie, but no.
It's a lie. Mitch McConnell has no friend.
Yeah, exactly. So we have to be able to make those distinctions. And as the previous panel indicated, there's a whole lot of things that are worthy of investigation. Right. We have a broken border immigration policy. But that's not the same thing. And exploring that and exploring solutions to that is not the same thing as saying Joe Biden has an open border policy and that's why we have a fentanyl problem. It's ridiculous.
Right.
We know that that's ridiculous. Hunter Biden, there is a serious investigation going on. It's obvious that he is has had a troubled life, and law enforcement authorities are exploring it. Is it an open question at this moment whether or not Joe Biden was somehow criminally complicit with him? No, there's no reason to think it is. Anything's possible, but there's no reason to think that, as the previous panel indicated. People have looked at that, no evidence has emerged. And so I just think people have to use their common sense in evaluating information and be willing to say, this is, side X says 2 + 2 is 4, side Y says 2 + 2 is 5. We don't say, well, one side says this, the other side says this, time will tell. No, we know the difference between the two, and we need to say that.
Can I say something really quickly about John? Because I think he was being incredibly humble. I remember some of the last stand-up shots you did for CNN and how important and how significant they were. And when you started your comments of, I can't tell what reporters what to do, but I can tell you how I think about my job, my first thought and my first concern, because I always think we should be talking about systems and institutions, because the American people, I think, are smarter than we give them credit for, particularly people in DC. And when people profit off of the brokenness, whether it is a political party that profits politically or a corporate media that profited immensely from the Trump years, the incentive structure for good government is gone. And the old incentives didn't really work. And so I think it's important for people to approach these questions in the same way that you did. But I really worry that there's not the space and the infrastructure for that, and the kind of massive transformation that we would need to have to meet this moment. There hasn't been enough reflection to get us there. Like, I think about the fact that the New York Times doesn't have a public editor, and it drives me nuts every day. This is the personal hill that I will die on, that there isn't a person at the New York Times who holds its entire operation of journalism accountable to the people and helps other people understand and demystify what's happening. That would be better for journalists and would be better for the public. And yet we're still years from the former editor of that publication saying that Twitter was a good replacement for that. Twitter's gonna disappear and the New York Times still won't have a public editor. And so when we're talking about these things, we really have to think about the institutions, because there aren't 100 John Harwoods and they're not running the world. And so what do we do with that, I think, is a really big question.
I think that's a really good point, Meredith. Thank you. Kurt, let me go to you, because I think a lot of this centers on trying to get people to care, right? Trying to make the public understand how much on the brink we are in terms of doing real harm. I mean, I think we've already done it to our democracy and to our institutions, if we've talked about. How, and you're on the air almost every day pushing back on all of these lies, and you do a great job at that. How do we get to the psyche of those voters, more so the swing voters, the independent voters, to understand that there is really a difference between what's going on with the Republican Party, who's being led by the MAGA caucus, and the harm that they are doing to our institutions, because they are now in our institutions, and it's even more dangerous. What kind of language do we use?
Well, I think it starts with actually offering the public, the voters, an actual contrast. It's not enough just to say, this thing over here is bad, this thing over here is corrupt, this thing over here is whatever. Ultimately, governing is about prioritizing. And so, in the same breath that you say, hey, these are taxpayer-financed witch hunts, you also have to say what they should be doing is spending their time addressing the economy, addressing inflation, addressing healthcare, addressing education, addressing the things that actually impact your day-to-day life. Nobody in America gives a crap about anyone's particular emails or documents. It does not affect their life. It does not affect how they're going to try to get their kid to school, get their kid to practice, go to the grocery store, do the 75,000 things that all of us try to do throughout our normal day-to-day lives. They are not tuning in to the majority of the noise that is going on in Washington. And so every time, if they do check in, whether it's on social media, whether it's turning on the news, whether it's reading a paper, watching local news. Our side needs to make sure that they realize that the other side is making a conscious decision not to focus on the things that actually impact your day-to-day life. We don't always do that very well. We do a very good job at saying, hey, this is terrible, this sucks, these people are awful, and all the different adjectives we use to describe them. We don't necessarily offer the other side of that equation about what time should be spent doing. You know, to follow up on what you guys were talking about a minute ago, one of the things, and you know, this was my job for 5 years, working at the Oversight Committee for Republicans and working in the media. My philosophy always was, in trying to be effective, that there is a competition going on in Washington to always be first, to always have the scoop, to beat their competitors. It was so painfully easy for me to call up a reporter and say, hey, we're going to issue a subpoena tomorrow. Would you like that first? And if not, that's cool. I'll just call your competitor. Of course that reporter is going to say, absolutely, we want that. What someone in my position was counting on was that that reporter would act not as a mouthpiece for us, but more as a stenographer to eliminate.
What is the difference in your mind between a mouthpiece and a stenographer?
I think a mouthpiece actually has a bias towards that side. I think a stenographer thinks themselves that I'm just reporting what is happening. I'm not taking a side. But if I'm the one giving you the information, and my favorite kind of story when I had that job.
You're defining it first.
My favorite kind of story was the one that said, Chairman Darrell issued subpoena to Obama administration about X. Here's what the subpoena says. Here's what we're asking for. Here's a quote from Darrell Issa. And oh, by the way, here's a quote from the ranking Democrat, Elijah Cummings, saying this is terrible. I love that story because 3/4 of that is exactly the narrative that we want. It's the first narrative we're going to have, and it's what every reporter after that is going to form some opinion off of that first piece. And when it's in the Washington Post first, or the New York Times, or CNN, it carries a legitimacy. I would never give Fox News first on anything because they're already on our side. Why would I do that? There's nothing new there for me. I'm going to try to go to the most legitimate news sources possible because if they report it that way, it is magically legitimate. That is what Republicans right now are counting on. They are counting that the majority of the reporters that they give things to first are going to just treat it as stenography and not inject the context, the things that John was just talking about, into that story. Because if they do that, if they try to go that way, they'll never get another story again first, and the Republican spokesperson will then just give it to a competitor who will present it the way that they want.
So John, then what does a reporter do in facing that?
Well, I think there are two different aspects of coverage that we're talking about. One is what you cover, and the other is how big you blow it up, right. Like the volume and the proportion. Well, I think one of the biggest problems for the press over the course of my career has been saying things that are true, but losing perspective as to where they fit in the larger picture. So you could do a story. I mean, the classic example is the story near the end of the campaign in 2016 when the Wiener laptop generates this letter from Comey, and it's a massive story in the New York Times. Again, I don't know how much difference it made that it was a massive story in the New York Times, but it was a ridiculous story. I think it was kind of apparent at the time. Comey had already given a very exhaustive summary of the investigation, which I think was made a pretty clear conclusion that however ill-advised it was for Hillary Clinton to do what she did with the emails, and yes, there were a few things with classified markings that moved through that system. There was nothing intentional about it, and there was no major national security consequence. But if there's an investigation going on, if a reporter wants to say, what am I supposed to do? It's an FBI investigation. It's a huge deal. You can make a qualitative judgment using your common sense as to how much substance really is there and therefore how large of a story it is.
So Meredith, how do then an organization like Facts First, what is the best way that we can make sure that journalists are covering these investigations in the way that they should, in calling out the BS that is on one side, and then the legitimacy of the other side and pushing back?
That's a really great question, and I feel like there's so many things I want to say in response to it, and part of my mind is still on what Kurt was talking about, because I was at Politico in 2009 and 2010. I was thinking about all of the reporters. I know the reporters who were working with him, and this sort of goes back to the incentive structure, right? Like, I don't live in Washington anymore. I live in Chicago. But I know the people who were sort of involved in that time. You don't need me to spill the beans on who it was. There's a whole chapter in a Mark Leibovich book about it. But
Never heard of it.
yeah, all of those people got to grow in their careers in DC, and I'm not sure this scoop-driven journalism is good for government. And so I think your question goes to what should be the foundation of Washington, whether it's our politics or our media coverage or the constellation of groups that are supposed to support these things. And so I think about 3 pillars. I think about accountability. I think about objectivity, and I'll get to that in a second because I used scare quotes. And then I also think about selection. And I'll start with the last first because John was saying something that was so smart. I think the under-discussed superpower of people who have influence is the power of selection. I teach public policy students. I always talk about how powerful selection is. And when people used to pick up print newspapers, it was actually easy to describe how selection was powerful, because you had a reporter who was selecting who to talk to, what story to pursue, an editor who was choosing how to frame it, headline, another editor who was choosing where to put it on the page. The New York Times, with that last story in the 2016 cycle, had a ton of power because they had the power of selection. And then that sort of feeds into this idea of accountability and objectivity. What is the point of journalism? What is the point of government? And who should we be accountable to? And if we're supposed to be accountable to the public, because the goal is government of some kind, right? I think part of the problem is people who have been here since the 80s or the 90s, they think that it's this fight between limited government and big government, when right now it's government at all and no government. And that's a huge paradigm shift that we should acknowledge. And then objectivity. The open secret of Washington is that there are these unspoken rules. Both sides' journalism comes from this idea of objectivity, but is not objective to the truth, and it is selected towards the lived experience of certain people. Like, no knock on white dudes who went to Ivy League schools. They're very smart and they're very accomplished, but their lived experience isn't every lived experience. I've talked about this a lot in the past few years. I lost a pregnancy and I had a birth outcome that is potentially going to be criminalized in states across this country and federally. And there are Republicans in this country who would like to put my physicians in jail. That is a true fact about me. A lot of people hearing me state that about myself would say that I was biased, but a person who's never given birth or a person who's had a normal birth outcome is not biased. And the question is why? And this is obviously, like, I'm a white woman, so I have a certain level of privilege here. There are people of color in this town, women of color in this town. They have lived experiences that diverge from that norm. And so who are all of these rules for? And I don't think that they're for the public. So part of this isn't just rapid response to these investigations, but it's a massive reframing of what the purpose of all of this is.
I think that is such a good point. As an immigrant Latina, I absolutely agree with you. Kurt, I want to go to you because I do think that this is something that we probably don't think enough about, which is the changing demographics in this country and how that is actually driving a lot of political outcomes. The Democratic Party obviously is doing a lot to make sure that they speak to these changing demographics as they have become a lot of their supporters and a big base of the party. Do these investigations, do these sort of inside baseball types of issues, do they speak to these changing demographics? And what should we do to make sure that they do speak to them more? Because to me, it's a lot about what you care about in terms of outcome for your government, as you were saying, Meredith.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, in the first panel, one of the topics they brought up that Republicans will focus on is this intent view of China. To someone who looks like me, that investigation, that process is going to feel very different to, well, everybody else in this room, I suppose. As someone who lived through the COVID-19 rhetoric of China virus, Kung flu, saw the dramatic rise in hate crimes against the AAPI community, I know intuitively exactly what the rhetoric around the China investigation is going to be and what the byproduct of that is going to be for my community. When I look at the overarching people who are going to be chronicling those investigations, I generally don't see a whole lot of people who look like me. And so I wonder at times, will that element be lost on them as Jim Jordan or James Comer are up there on the dais warning about the dangers of China, how they unleashed a virus on all the American people, I wonder if that's going to be missed at all. And so when I think about the roles of other organizations, providing that context and that lens, I think, is also important because it's so easy to miss. And no one's missing that intentionally, but it goes back to, again, like you said, lived experience. If that has never been your experience, if that's not a thought that's ever had to enter your mind, I don't expect you to think of it, but we need to have people that are positioned to be able to point that out.
Well, particularly because it's the design.
Right.
This isn't accidental that these things are happening. This is part of a strategy because there is an overall political calculus happening to try to suppress the changes you're talking about. Because if there weren't, the political map would look very different, and that's another huge structural conversation. Probably a different panel, but I think it's worth noting.
Well, and that's the thing, too. It's like with the Oversight Committee. Most people don't know this. The Oversight Committee has jurisdiction over the U.S. Census. What did they try to do during the Trump administration? They tried to dramatically affect how the census is conducted so they could deliberately undercount minorities and communities of color and disadvantaged communities. Why? Because they know that if the playing field is level, there's more of us than there are of them. We know from the census that by 2035 or 2041 or whatever, that we're going to be a majority minority country in America. So the only chance they have to electoral survival is to try to limit the amount of minorities who are able to participate in the democratic process. They try to do that and codify that through the work at the Oversight Committee. Everything that we have seen from the Republican Party since Donald Trump came onto the scene needs to be seen through the lens of race, because that's at the heart of everything. The reason why they wanted to deny the election. When they say people are voting who shouldn't be voting, they ain't talking about white people in Iowa, okay? When they talk about trying to, the systemic voter suppression laws that were passed after the 2016 election in key states, that's what it's all about. When you talk about election deniers, you look at the 14 election deniers that just got appointed to the House Oversight Committee. There's a reason why I think all but one of them is white. So that has to be part of that conversation, at least, again, how the media filters the motivation behind what is going on. That's one that at times gets overlooked.
Could I just make one point about the challenge facing the press, which I think is behind some of this? Meredith was talking about conventions of journalism that people have in their heads and that they follow. Those conventions existed for good reason, but were designed for a country where you're talking about a large, diverse country that nevertheless accepts some common basis of fact. And you presume disagreements of good faith between people of different views. That's not the world that we're living in right now politically. And so if you're a news organization, you're a business, you're trying to maximize the number of people watching your outlet or reading your outlet. And if a significant chunk from the get-go is presuming that you're not going to be telling the truth, that is a bracing reality for news executives. And so the impulse to try to make those people feel you're going the extra mile to accommodate their views, that's a strong impulse that I understand. That being said, we still have to be true to ourselves and true to realities that we can see with our own eyes. I think journalists have to, as best they can, step away from those pre-existing notions of what fairness represents and tie the fairness with which they present something to what they believe and know to be true.
Can I ask, and I can get this question to all three of you, there's been a big prominence in the last election cycle, and frankly in the one before, of fact checkers, right? Should we have more of those? Is that something that matters? I mean, a lot of those do get a lot of attention, but what do you all think about that?
So I think that there are two different ways to answer that question. I think about traditional fact checkers at magazines and news organizations who work behind the scenes to make sure copy is better. And then there's this like fact checking industry within
right?
media,
Exactly.
and I want to be careful because I don't want to malign the journalists who do that sort of work, but I actually think that fact check as a vertical is deeply problematic because it makes it appear to the average reader that the facts aren't part of the core story. When you create a silo for something called the fact check, it actually projects this idea that that's separate when it's integrated to the reporting. And this goes back to selection, the things that get decided to be fact-checked in trying to fact-check enough Democratic things versus Republican things means that disproportionately you're seeing that false equivalence, but under this guise of something that feels more formal and fact-oriented. And so it's different, I think, when an outside organization is trying to do it, but from a journalistic perspective, it just projects this notion that facts aren't part of the core story, that it has to be this separate kind of work, when in reality, it should be the work that goes into reporting every day. When I worked at Roll Call, and I'm looking at Warren because I see him in the audience, we had a copy desk, and they did fact checking, and they were the best at it. And as a reporter, I loved living with the comfort of that I was going to write about a particular vote history, and I knew there was going to be someone at the office making sure that I didn't mess it up. Like, that's important in the production of accurate journalism, and unfortunately, as newsrooms have lost resources, those are some of the first people to go. But from the sort of general population question that you're asking, I actually think it's not that productive to journalism.
What do you think, John?
I'm a little more bullish on the fact-checking industry that has arisen. That there may be bias involved in my part because one of the principal drivers of that trend was an old colleague of mine at the newspaper I started at, the St. Petersburg Times, Bill Adair.
And a love of ours. I was trying to be careful.
Well,
We both went to Duke. John is the more important Duke alum.
Don't
hate us. I'm sorry. I just outed us as like bad people in
Well,
Washington as
that
Blue Devils.
gets
Hey,
to
I went to Duke too.
that gets to a credibility point.
Sorry, Kurt. You're not on the panel anymore.
I didn't go to college at all, so I
That PolitiFact, which Bill started, then got moved to Duke University, where Bill is now a professor. And I guess it's an objectivity test for the people in this room. Does it enhance or detract from the credibility of this panel to know that 3 of the 4 people went to Duke University?
Detracts, probably.
That's funny. Kurt, what do you think on the fact-checking
I
thing?
think this is a great example of how Republicans do a very effective job at what I call working the referees. I remember when I worked in Congress back in 2010, the then Judiciary Committee Chairman Lamar Smith started this thing called the Media Fairness Caucus, which existed solely to point out all the liberal bias that existed in the media, and really the theory being that, well, if they point this out all the time, reporters will go out of their way to try to appear unbiased, and in doing so will overlook a lot of the exaggerations that Republicans are constantly willing to make. If you were to do something that most reporters probably can't say publicly, but I think is true, is in this moment in time, Republicans lie more than Democrats. They have made lying a centerpiece of their entire party and their entire agenda. I have never known a chairwoman, Carolyn Maloney, to start a hearing with the intent of lying and misleading the American people. I never knew a chairman, Elijah Cummings, whose birthday would be today, by the way, to go up there and start every hearing trying to lie and mislead the American people. I cannot say that about Jim Jordan, about James Comer, about Kevin McCarthy, and we know that because they are on tape saying things privately to each other about January 6th and Donald Trump that they do not say publicly. They have outed themselves. If every story that was written about them forever began with known liar Kevin McCarthy, that would be completely true and accurate. I can't say the same thing about the Democrats that are in power right now. Do people lie? Do they exaggerate? Sure. Do they do so with the knowing intent of misleading the American people, of fomenting domestic terrorism in America? Those are very different things. And so I think any vehicle that we have to expose that is important. But I also think that as we have them, they can't fall into the trap of Republican opposition researcher calling up fact check saying, hey, this guy needs 5 Pinocchios because of whatever, and you come, and I've seen this. Every Republican says, well, you called this person out, so you need to call this person out too. It shouldn't work that way.
And that leads us into our next panel about George Santos. No, I'm just kidding. But no, I think we're out of time, sadly. I would love to have a panel on George Santos. But I do just want to end by saying that, again, I think this underscores, David talked about this, the reason why facts first is so important. We will always lead with facts, but we will also underscore the importance of messaging, because we all also talked about this, how Democrats on our side have always been so dependent on how we know that what we're saying is the truth, and we always love our 20-point plans because we know it's the right thing to do. Well, Republicans just say 3 words, and that's what gets etched into the psyche of American voters. So we're going to be fighting fire with fire, always based on facts, but making sure that the messaging is relevant, compelling, truthful, and that it makes sense to everyone who is listening to us. So I want to thank this panel. We could be talking for hours about this, and hopefully this won't be the last time. So thank you all for being here today.
Just want to thank everyone for coming today. I promise that our George Santos panel will be UNC grads only. So thank you.